And if I'm looking sort of across the board, that's because I'm trying to get things on 3 different screens. So don't feel ignored. Good morning. I think I've met pretty much all of you in earlier talks or anything. Regardless, I'm Gefion. I'm working at King's College London. We will be in touch a lot about negotiations, but I also have a personal research and practice expertise in online engagement. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, particularly about the practice of building and engaging online communities or communities online. I have done a bit of research on this, but I've effectively covered most of that in my talk on diversity yesterday. So happy to take any questions on that. But the focus of what I'm going to talk about today will be what I've done in practice. And that is, well, I have built a large number of online communities. I've done that in politics between 2010 and 2014, where I've been a leader of a political party that was primarily dealing with things online. I was based in the UK, they were based in Germany, so by default, everything was online. And I just made it work. And then I've set up an arts project at the end of 2019, which has only just finished, which is also primarily online. And through all of this, I found some commonalities that may or may not be useful for you, and I hope they are. And in the key thing that I found is that it's hard to get right, even when you start from a good place, and you have to put a lot of work into it. Building an online community is not something that you do once and then it runs. It's something that needs constant engagement and constant effort to keep going. And it needs a good deal of leadership. Now, what I've done, let me just briefly say a little bit more about the things that I have done so I can contextualize what I'm going to talk about in a moment. In politics, what I've done is I've set up a number of service groups that then served various functions that the party required. So for example, we had a press team that was responding to queries from journalists or engaging with the general public in instances, or just doing general outreach activities. And that group, all of them were based on volunteers. So if you remember, if you've been in Neil's talk yesterday, this is all very much on the, what's it called? Now my words are gone. On the altruistic side of motivation. So this is very much people having an internal motivation to do things. We didn't pay anyone ever, aside from, you know, a single person who just did a major job. So it was a lot about not only making it work online, but also making it work with volunteers at the same time. And then in arts, what I've done is I've put together a group that created a major artwork with a team of about 50, 60 people, and came up with the concept, put together the structure, made it work, recruited a team, created it, and now we're just finalizing, you know, bits and pieces and closing at the end of the month. So the first thing for all of these is to consider what the group will achieve, and define the goals that will keep the group together. And I put there, it's really important that everyone agrees that these are worthwhile goals, because that is effectively how you recruit them into the group in the first place. So for example, in those service groups that I've built, and I had one for press, and I had one for editing, and I had one for our own news, and I had, I think by now they still exist, I'm not involved anymore, but they just kept popping up for various different services that were required, like first aid at events, for example. And the important bit was to agree upfront what they were there for. So speaking of the news team, the core motivation was for the party to have a service that created a regular flow of relevant news to the membership. It started as a newsletter, then it became a blog, then it became a little bit more. We ended up actually printing stuff. But the core function, the core thing that the group wanted to achieve was to maintain that regular flow of news so that the party members would be informed about what happened. Sorry. And the next step in that is to define that. So you define that goal and you define it clearly and you put it down in writing. And define a mission statement. And that is effectively something you can hold up in public and say, this is what you do. And if this is what you're interested in, then you can come and join us. And especially working with volunteers, in my case, that has always been a community decision. So I would go in and write a draft and make a proposal and say, this is what I think we should do. This is, as a leader of the party, this is what we need. But then I would discuss that with the group and have the group as a community decide about that. Now, getting people into that community wasn't, in this case, particularly hard because I had, as a party, you have a set number of members, and we had a network to reach out to them. But you for the arts group, for example, I just came up with the concept and then talked about that on various online channels where I knew the people who would potentially be interested would be about. And that worked as well. Have I covered everything? Yes. And that's really what brings me into getting people into it, because what motivated people to join these groups in the first place was a sort of passion or interest in that shared goal. So what I wanted to achieve is I wanted to create a group that fulfilled that service, that created that artwork, that fulfilled that goal. And the people who joined me in doing that were people who shared that passion, were people who were interested in achieving that goal. Also people who felt that they could contribute. So making it easy and making it obvious that they can contribute is crucial, because otherwise they'll think, oh yeah, that's a nice thing. I'll be interested in using that service. I'll be interested in consuming that artwork, but I wanted them to come in and contribute and do something to make it happen. So for that, it's important to communicate that they can contribute, who can contribute, and what they can contribute. So for example, for that artwork, I needed a number of voice actors. I needed people who could create images, who could create graphics. I needed people who could take care of social media channels. I needed people who could sort of do back-end administrative work. And when I reached out and said, look, I want to put this together, I did this with the vision, and here's a list of things you could be doing. So just because at first glance it doesn't look like this is something that is relevant to your skill set, it doesn't matter what your skill set is, we'll find something for you to do. And we ended up suddenly with a composer coming on and saying, hey, look, I'd like to write a soundtrack for you, which wasn't what I had expected, but I had made it open enough so that people felt they could just come in and say, this is what I want to do. And that in turn was extremely engaging because people felt they had a stake in what I was doing. And that, in a way, happened overnight. So for this arts project, I've been pondering doing it. I've been sort of working my way around a concept on the side while I was doing a lot of other things. And And then I got very sudden support from some senior people in the wider community in which that happened, who advertised this being a thing, this going to happen, and that obviously helped in spreading the word. So I think these intermediaries can have a really crucial role in recruiting people, also motivating people, but that you still have to have that motivation, that mission statement, that goal that they can communicate. So it's the two things: having that goal, having that structure that allows engagement, and then having the reach in the potentially relevant community that can help you actually talk to the right people and draw them in. Now that was getting the community together. That was, effectively getting people on a mailing list or on a Discord server, or, however you communicate. And obviously that should be as accessible as possible. So I tended to offer email, Twitter, depending on the community, Discord or Skype, or back in the day, I think probably ICQ. So that, I think I said that in my talk yesterday, having a variety of contact methods absolutely helped, because I had some people who couldn't join a server but were very happy to engage via Twitter and just contribute bits and pieces, which is still useful. The main thing for people who wanted to engage longer term was to, when they come in, give them something to do and signpost very clearly what they can do. So for those service groups, we had like a wiki page that just outlined exactly who we are, what we do, what communication methods we use, and how you can sign up to them, if possible and allowed, with a direct link. Then when someone joined one of those networks, actually, say, welcome to the team, what do you want to do? Have a quick conversation if possible, just to see what they want to do, and then signpost them to where that happens. In the beginning, I did that myself. Later on, I had a number of people in the group who would do that on my behalf, so that it becomes, if you're speaking to 100 people at once, it becomes a lot. But you also have those 100 people who want something to do, and some of them don't want to, write, or don't want to, in your case, collect data, whatever the case may be. But you can still include them in the activities. So signposting newcomers so that they feel instantly included is really important, because otherwise they come in, they look around for a couple of minutes, couple of hours, maybe a day, and if they don't see where they fit in, they leave or they disengage. So that first joining moment is really the most important. And then also create a sense of community. And I know that is very easily said and very complicated in practice. The way I used to do that is I was present. So actually, if it's on the mailing list, actually engage. If it's on a Discord server or a Slack or whatever you use, actually be present, talk to people, be seen from a sort of a perceived leadership perspective. I always do regular calls or some sort of, so everything online by default kind of happens asynchronously. So people do things in their own time, and that works great for crowdsourcing. But if you want to have a sense of community, you kind of sometimes have to get people all together in the same room. And I did that with having a call every other week or once a month, depending on the group, to talk about what people are up to, what people are interested in, what they are doing, what they have done, to celebrate achievements and say publicly, well done you, thank you for your contribution, depending on what it was. I also did that by allowing people to come up with their own ideas and their own and be involved in the decision making. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But in that arts community, for example, I had a schedule for when things would be published. And I had a plan for how we would do that. And we worked out exactly how that worked step by step in the group. But then the group came up with, oh, we need all of this social media, and then we need teasers a day before, and then we need a 12-hour teaser, and then we need a post about specific contributions a day later. And suddenly I had a whole group of 10 people in that wider community who were all over social media, registering accounts on Instagram and on Facebook and, you know, platforms I'd never heard of, quite frankly, and just kept promoting what we were doing in their, and they made that decision on their own, and that was perfectly fine because they started to own the project themselves. They had a stake in it, they wanted it to work, and they took it forward. And allowing the freedom for people to do that sort of thing, if your project allows it, is a really strong motivator that keeps people engaged. Obviously, you sort of have to keep tabs on exactly how that works and exactly what they are doing so they don't run wild. But if you have a well-defined mission statement and a well-defined goal and people all try to achieve the same thing, then this can work quite easily. I've already covered positive feedback and actually telling people, you know, thanking people, making sure they feel appreciated for the contribution they make. Not only making them feel appreciated, but actually appreciating it, which is sometimes a difference, and people can usually tell if you don't mean it. So really having that positive attitude toward contributions is quite important. And then there's having a structure in place. And that is for communication, that is for tasks, that is for documentation. So in this arts community, we had, as I mentioned earlier, various different workflows and various different things that people could contribute. And each of those had its own process flow where people could come into the group. We could signpost them to, so if you want a voice act, this is how you do it. And there was a guide to go with that that said, this is how you set up your recording studio. This is how you, or your equipment, not studio. This is how you set it up. This is how you record. This is how you edit. This is how you submit your contribution. And that sort of workflow existed for every task that was documentable. So like minor admin things, there was no point in documenting because you do them once and then they're done. But having those processes for the larger things makes it instantly easier for anyone joining the team to just pick something up and run with it. I also found a general task list for those minor things really useful, especially in the beginning. So when I started this, I was on my own, then I had a friend join me, and I just had a large list of stuff that needed doing, and some of them were really small and some of them were big chunks of work, but sort of very administrative, like go to this web page and look at all of the people who have contributed X and contact them for recruitment. And I just had a list of things that needed doing. I pointed newcomers to that list and they started picking things up and doing them. And then also had that clear structure for communication. So I quite like things like Discord or Slack for that sort of thing, where you can have different channels for different activities. And I know some of you already use that. A mailing list can work, but feels slightly outdated now. I still use it a lot in what I do in research, but those are people who are paid to engage, whose job it is to work on things. And still then something more direct like Slack is very useful, but then it has to be well structured so people know what to put where, know if I have a question about X, in which channel do I put that, who is the person I need to talk to? So having clear leadership roles was important as well. So people obviously knew me in each of these cases because I was the main person doing the outreach. I was the publicly perceived lead of the project. But then depending on how large the group becomes, that can become a barrier because people very often feel that they shouldn't be bothering you with questions. So either being extremely obviously available or having other people who say, if you have questions about artwork, speak to X. If you have questions about voice acting, speak to Y. If you have questions about organizational things, speak to this person over there. That sort of structure and that sort of signposting is also really effective because it makes people actually approach you. Whereas the silent lurkers are very hard to draw in if you have a structure that makes it really easy for them to see what they can do, to see who they can ask a question without having the feeling of being a burden. That works really well. And then in all of that communication, I also always offer an opportunity for personal engagement. So yes, it's about the project, and yes, it's about achieving a goal together. But to have that community, people also need to babble about their dog doing some stupid thing or share a cat photo or, have a moan about a bad day or have a small celebration because they've just finished something. And having, in a server, for example, one channel dedicated to just personal communication really helps get that sense of community. And so that's how I got them going. That's how I kept them going. And then one thing I'm always really keen on is having the group involved in decisions, as I said earlier. This is partly where I come from. I mean, I've been in politics. People want to decide stuff there all the time. And it's also, it gives, being involved in the decision-making of a group gives people an actual stake in that group and makes them feel more committed. And now you can make decisions in various ways. And, a very common thing, especially in work contexts, is just by authority. You have a leader, you have a boss, and they know best and they decide. And that works great, but it's really not engaging at all. So deciding things top down, sometimes you have to. I always find, especially where finances are involved, there is a slight necessity for that. On the other hand, you can make even those participatory if it's possible in your setup. So ask questions about that if you're interested. What I found most common in politics was giving people a vote. People really like voting in politics. And that is engaging. People feel they have a stake. If the community works well, people will accept votes even if they don't go their way, although US politics currently shows us how that works, what that looks like when it doesn't work. But majority voting can be risky if you have very diverse groups, because there's always a danger of a minority being voted out and then subsequently disengaging. So generally, I think voting works, but it only works if you have a cohesive group that takes care of each other and that cares what happens to potential minorities in their midst. What tends to work really well in volunteer communities, if they are not too large, is making decisions by consensus. Which is what you would do, when you go out, when you are allowed to go out with your friends and try to decide which movie you want to watch. You talk about it and then you kind of agree. This is the most, so just talking things out and then finding consensus is the most engaging way of making decisions in groups like this. but it can be very slow, and occasionally it can be impossible if you have very, very contradictory views in the group. What I found works best in practice is have a deliberation phase, have people talk things out, and either after a limited amount of time, you find a consensus, or you find the two opposing views, and then you put those to a vote. In practice, that's what I've done in all of my teams, and it has always worked. Sometimes there are just things that cannot be bridged, but I would hope that in your cases, the possibility for that is fairly limited. And there is no one best way to do it. The best way to do it may always be a combination of these three approaches. And I think that is the end of my 30 minutes.